Hello, hello. How does it sound? Okay. We're live. This is book 8. Book 8, day 8. Book 8, week 2 of the ongoing teaching. We're starting off our racial injustice week with The Color of Law. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Rothstein? I always have trouble with that. Rothstein or Rothstein? Steen? Okay. Rothstein? Yeah. Okay. Chapter 2. Public Housing, Black Ghettos. The purposeful use of public housing by federal and local governments to herd African Americans into urban ghettos had as big an influence as any in the creation of our de jure. De jure? De jure. De jure?
Yeah, you see it a lot. The juror segregation, the two segments, de facto segregation and the juror segregation.
The juror
segregation.
De jure. Yeah. De jure. Our de jure system of segregation. Most Americans have an image of public housing. Groups of high-rise towers and a few amenities like playgrounds or parks packed next to one another in central city neighborhoods, plagued by crime and drugs, and filled with black or Hispanic mothers and their children. It's mostly inaccurate. It's a mostly inaccurate image even today. But it couldn't be further from the reality of public housing when it began in the mid-20th century. At that time, public housing was mostly for working and lower middle class white families. It was not heavily subsidized. Let me show you this picture. Can't even really see it. This ring light too bright. But that is Detroit, 1943. A family moves into the segregated sojourner. Truth. Public housing project, having withstood equivocation by federal officials in rioting in white neighborhood. Okay. It was not heavily subsidized, and tenants paid the full cost of operations with their rent. Public housing's original purpose was to give shelter, not to decide those too poor to afford it, but to those who could afford decent housing but couldn't find it because none was available. In New York City, for example, from World War II to 1955, the Housing Authority constructed 20 large unsubsidized projects for middle-class families, all of whom rent that covered the housing costs. Many projects were attractive, low-rise, 6-story developments with trees, grassy areas, and park benches. In addition to giving priority to veterans, the authority maintained a list of 21 disqualifying factors for prospective tenants, including irregular employment history, single-parent family, or an out-of-wedlock birth, criminal record, narcotic addiction, mental illness, poorly behaved children, poor housekeeping habits, and lack of sufficient furniture. To ensure that undesirable tenants were not accepted, the Housing Authority sent agents to inspect the conditions in which applicants kept their previous homes, often shared with relatives. Couples had to show a marriage license before their application was accepted. The Boston Housing Authority had similar requirements for its middle-class projects for white families. The federal government first developed housing for civilians. Living quarters on military bases had long been in existence during World War I, when it built residences for defense workers near munition plants. 83 projects in 26 states housed 170,000 people. 170,000 white workers and their families. African Americans were excluded, even from projects in northern and western industrial centers where they worked in significant numbers. Racial segregation, forcing African Americans into overpopulated slums. When the war ended, the government sold off its existing projects to private real estate firms and canceled those that were not complete. Beginning with the Great Depression of the 1930s and into the early 1950s, working in middle class white as well as African American families faced a serious housing shortage. In the Depression, only the affluent could afford to purchase homes or rent new apartments, so builders couldn't be induced to provide housing for others. World War II exacerbated the shortage because all construction material was appropriated for military purposes. Working and lower middle class families doubled up with relatives, stayed in apartments that were too small for their growing families, or remained in emergency Quonset? I never seen that word. Quonset. 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 I'm going to Quonset. Quonset huts that had been put up toward the end of the war for returning veterans. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal created the nation's first public housing for civilians who were not engaged in defense work. Race determined the program's design. The administration constructed separate projects for African Americans, segregated buildings by race, or excluded African Americans entirely from developments. Segregation in the administration's housing programs followed a pattern that was established by New Deal construction. Employment, and job agencies. An early initiative was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, created in 1933 to bring jobs and economic growth to a region whose suffering during the Depression had been unusually severe. In Norris, Tennessee, where the TVA housed its African American workers. Are you hungry? Would you like food? Jessica, I don't want to say it. Yeah.
I'm okay personally.
Yeah, I'm okay. I had a little, a small little breakfast before I left.
What? You had a little what?
A little breakfast.
Oh.
What do you think I said?
I don't know what you said. It just was funny because the way you described it as a little small, like,
Yeah.
the commentary was funny.
What happened to the water? That's what I need. I need the water. Oh, it's over there.
That's the flavor water.
That's the flavor water?
That lady. That's got it in the constant.
Mmm.
You, got this for you.
I don't have no more coconut water.
Should I strawberry vanilla?
Oh, damn, that's crazy. I do. It's so beautiful. Okay, I apologize.
that might end up going negatively.
Oh, damn. Life is so crazy. That's why I'm so glad I have this pocket, because you can just.
Yeah, I don't like pockets that don't got zippers. It's dangerous.
Yeah, it is. Okay, we're gonna get back to reading. Let's just. No. Okay, never mind. An early initiative was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, created in 1933 to bring jobs and economic growth to a region whose suffering during the Depression had been unusually severe. In Norris, Tennessee, where the TVA was headquartered, the government developed a model village with 500 comfortable homes leased to employees and construction workers. The village, though, was open to only whites, while the TVA housed its African American workers in shoddy barracks some distances away. A TVA official explained that the town was being reserved for whites because I feel like this is going to come up a lot. The other N word.
Negroes?
Yeah.
This ain't so-called Negroes.
No.
You want to use blacks or black people?
Yeah, that's what I've been doing.
Yeah.
But I've been doing it for the first thing you said.
Negroes.
No. I guess the second thing you said.
Blacks.
Yes, I've been doing that in place of.
You're going to have a long weekend. You've been doing that.
Yes, I know. I feel like this is gonna be
This is gonna
come.
be a long book.
Yes, I know. Okay. A TVA official explained that the town was being reserved for whites because black people do not fit into the program. Other New Deal agencies shared this commitment to residential segregation. The Civilian Conservative Corps established work camps for jobless youth and young adults. These camps were segregated not just in the South, but often in the North as well. In New Jersey, for example, Governor Harold Hoffman refused to allow any camps for African American Corps members because of what he had termed local resentment. The National CCC director, Robert Fenchner implemented a policy never to force colored companies on localities that have openly declared their opposition to them. Initially, local administrators integrated some camps in western and midwestern states, but federal officials ordered racial segregation in these camps too. Many state and local governments refused to permit even segregated African American CCC camps within their borders. Federal officials Federal officials accommodated these demands, locating camps for African Americans on nearby army bases or on national forests or parkland. In Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, an African American CCC unit was assigned to work alongside a white one to restore the historic battleground. The white unit was housed near the town itself, but the town's residents objected to having the African American crew living in the vicinity. So the CCC set up a camp for the African American crew some 20 miles away, where housing was not merely the byproduct of a New Deal economic development or job program like the TVA or CCC, but was a direct object of Roosevelt's administration reform. Segregation was even more rigid. New Deal housing efforts were initially created as a project of the Public Works Administration, PWA. Established in 1933, shortly after Roosevelt took office. The PWA's goal was to alleviate a national housing shortage while creating jobs in construction. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, who directed the effort, had been president of the Chicago branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in the 1920s, and was one of the administration's few liberals on the racial matter. Although most officials intended public housing for middle and working class white families, Ickes, I'm gonna go with Ickes. The C is throwing me off. Ickes. That's what makes me leads me to believe that could be Ickes. Harold Ickes. Yeah. I'm gonna go Ickes though. But Ickes did not propose to integrate PWA development. One of the PWA's 47 projects, 17 were assigned to African Americans. 6 others were segregated by building. The rest were only for whites. Ickes established a neighborhood composition rule. Federal housing projects should reflect the previous racial composition of their neighborhood. Projects in white areas could house only white tenants. Those in African American areas could house only African American tenants. And only projects in already integrated neighborhoods could house both whites and black people. In Birmingham, Alabama, the PWA built a project restricted to African Americans in a neighborhood that the city had zoned for black residents only. The federal government took a similar approach in Miami, where it agreed to segregate housing for African Americans in areas that the city planners has designated exclusively for black residents. A Miami civic leader explained to federal administrators that the sites were chosen to remove the entire black population from places that have been reserved for white occupancy. Despite its nominal rule of respecting the prior racial composition of neighborhoods, itself a violation of African Americans' constitutional rights, the PWA segregated projects even when there was no previous pattern of segregation. At the time, many urban neighborhoods contained both black and white, mostly immigrant, low-income families. The neighborhoods were integrated because workers of both race needed to live close to the downtown factory jobs to which they walked. The PWA designated many integrated neighborhoods as either white or black, and then used public housing to make the designation come true by installing whites-only project in mixed neighborhoods, and deemed white and black-only projects in those it deemed black as well. The first PWA project, the Techwood Homes in Atlanta, opened in 1935. It was built on land cleared by demolishing the flats. A low-income integrated neighborhood adjacent to downtown that had included 1,600 families. Nearly one-third of whom were African American. The PWA remade the neighborhood with 604 units for white families only. The Techwood Project not only created a segregated white community, it also intensified the segregation of African American families who, evicted from their homes, could find new housing only by crowding into other neighborhoods where African Americans were already living. Some families evicted from the flats settled in a segregated development. Some families evicted from the flats settled in a segregated development, also created by the federal government, that later opened up on the west side. But because of the public housing was intended not for people, but for lower middle class families, many of those displaced from the flats had incomes that were insufficient to qualify. Instead, many had to double up with relatives or rent units created when other African American families subdivided their home. A result of the government program, therefore, was the increased population density that turned the African American neighborhoods into slums. In 1934, the city of St. Louis proposed to raise the DeSoto Car area, a tenement neighborhood on the near north side, whose population was split nearly evenly between white and African Americans. For the cleared site, the city proposed a whites-only low-rise project. When the federal government objected to the city's failure to accommodate African Americans, St. Louis agreed to a blacks-only project as well. In the end, St. Louis built a segregated development for African Americans in the DeSoto Car area, while it demolished another previously integrated neighborhood south of downtown to build a separate project for whites. Across the Northeast and Midwest, the PWA imposed segregation on integrated communities. In Cleveland, for example, the central neighborhood had been a packed but racially mixed tenement community. Housing African Americans along with Italian and Eastern European immigrants. Langston Hughes, the African American poet, playwright, and novelist, recounts in his autobiography that he had attended Central High School in the late 1910s. In the late 1910s, he dated a Jewish girl, and his best friend was Polish. Over the next 15 years, white families began to leave the central neighborhood, and African Americans had arrived. Yet many white families remained. Despite the neighborhood's biracial history, the PWA constructed two segregated projects, one for African Americans, the Outhwaite homes, and one for whites, the Cedar Central apartments. Although there previously had been ethnic and racial clusters in the neighborhood, the PWA solidified its racial segregation. The PWA also built on a third Cleveland project, Lakeview Terrace. Lakeview Terrace developed, as its name suggests, in a more scenic location. It was exclusively for whites. Like many other PWA projects for white families, but rarely like those for African Americans, Lakeview included a community center, playgrounds, and plentiful green spaces. Oh no, they're coming, I can feel it. This fucking... Sorry. And it was decorated with murals. PWA project also concentrated African Americans in low-income neighborhoods in Detroit, Indianapolis, Toledo, and New York, where, for example, the PWA created two segregated projects. The Williamsburg homes in a white neighborhood was for whites, and the Harlem River houses in a black neighborhood was for African Americans. Of the 26 projects built in the Northeast and Midwest, 16 were created for whites, 8 for African Americans, and 2 were internally segregated. In 1937, Congress ended the PWA program of direct federal construction of public housing and required localities wanting such projects to establish their own agencies that could then build housing with federal subsidies provided by the newly created U.S. Housing Authority, USHA. The authority continued the policy of claiming to respect existing neighborhood racial characteristics while in practice creating new, racially homogeneous communities. The USHA manual warned that it was undesirable to have projects with white families. Oh no! In areas now occupied by black people, and added, the aim of the local housing authority should be the preservation rather than the disruption of community social structures which best fit the desire of the groups concerned. The manual stated that projects in the previously integrated areas should be open to mixed occupancy, but this standard, like that of the PWA, was rarely honored. The first USHA-funded projects were built in Austin, Texas, largely because of the aggressive promotion by its congressman, Lyndon Johnson. Segregated projects were constructed for African Americans in East Austin's black neighborhood, and for whites on the west side. As elsewhere, I gotta stop right here. Let's see, I gotta stop right here. Hold on. This is starting to it's getting worse. I can feel it getting worse. Oh, this is so crazy. Alright. What do you want to do? Do you want to hop in? Do you want to...
I can hop in.
Hop in for like a little bit. You want to? Okay. Yeah, my body's so weak right now. I believe just right at the top. Right at the top of the page.
25. Okay. All right. Good luck. Okay. All right. Ari's dealing with some medical issues, so I'm going to pick up where he left off, or where I think he left off. I was trying to keep up and pay attention back there. Okay. Excuse me. This is right. Okay. All right. Let's see. What's today? Tomorrow's Saturday. All right. Okay. All right. Sorry, y'all. I gotta finish something up on here. It's very important. Trust me, I'm making the right decision. We are reading The Color of Law. We are on day 8. Yeah, we're on day 8. It's crazy. We're on day 8 of the ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square, something that we are going to be doing for the entirety of the month. I'm just going on. I'm on trying to get something for the ongoing teaching to say their name square. I'm trying to make sure I got it. I got it set right. So that's all I'm doing right now. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. Oh man, my eye. Ooh. Okay. We are reading The Color of Law. We are on Chapter 2, Public Housing, Black Ghettos. Please share this video. Go share this video. Okay, my fault, y'all. My eye. Rosewood Courts, Austin's East Side project for African Americans, was built on land obtained by condemning Emancipation Park, the site of an annual festival to commemorate the abolition of slavery. The park had been privately owned by a neighborhood association, the Travis County Emancipation Organization, and residents protested the condemnation of this community institution in which they took great pride. But their objections had no effect, despite the availability of other vacant land. Certainly, many urban areas already had distinct African American neighborhoods when the PWA or USHA came on the scene. Federal agencies cannot be charged with sole responsibility for segregation, but they reinforced it. In Chicago, for example, a substantial African American population in segregated neighborhoods predated the Depression. The PWA constructed 4 projects in that city. 2, the Julius C. Lathrop and Trumbull Park homes for white families, were in previously all-white communities. African-American families were assigned to the Ida B. Wells homes in an African-American neighborhood. The Jane Addams houses in a mostly white area that had some African-Americans was called integrated. The PWA gave about 3% of the Jane Addams units to African-Americans, but segregated them in a designated section within the project. I need something to... Hold on, y'all. No, sorry. I tried to do that off mic. I tried to do that off mic. I'm sorry. Okay. Ooh, it's a little chilly. All right, let's continue. It would be going too far to suggest that cities like these would have evolved into integrated metropolises were it not for the New Deal public housing. But it is also the case that the federal government's housing rules pushed these cities into a more rigid segregation than otherwise would have existed. The biracial character of many neighborhoods presented opportunities for different futures than the segregated ones that now seem so unexceptional. Yet those opportunities were never seized. Okay, so this is my first time jumping in and reading. One of the things that I want to point out is I think it's important that as we go through and start reading through some of the things in this Racial Injustice Week, I think it's important that we understand where some of these things will lead to. And so it's important as we read about, what city was this? Chicago, for example. It's important that as we read about Chicago, we see how the city got sectioned off into different communities, and then we can see what the future held, what the opportunities became for the communities. One of the things I had to learn very much is that integration wasn't so much about the idea that black people were trying to be seen as equal with white people. It was that in America, white people had set up a structure system for certain classes, excuse me, for certain classes of people to be able to have a certain amount of opportunity available to them that maybe other classes would not have available to them. And black people were put in a position where not only did they have to deal with class issues, but they also had to deal with color issues that kept them even removed from overcoming class. Like they couldn't overcome the color issues to even begin to try to grapple with class issues. My fault, y'all. Sorry. And so I say that to say these neighborhoods that people began to become relegated to, the people who then became elected officials and who were then in power started making decisions about opportunity, socioeconomic decisions based on those neighborhoods. So which streets got so let's say, for example, which area of the city has events there, and those events can then generate revenue. Which areas of the city, we haven't got into it, yet. We're still sort of early in the 1900s, but which areas of some of these cities get policed differently than other areas of these cities? It becomes harder to do this. It becomes harder to make this make these decisions racialized when black people and white people are living in shared spaces together. They become just completely classized. And in the midst of becoming classized, they do start to become colorblind in a sense, whether that's for the better or for the worse. And so it's important that we see that why we cannot afford to now become colorblind, because there were opportunities where this nation could have chose to try to be colorblind, and we maybe could have gotten to an equitable society where colorblindness was not something that was a myth, or something that people, or some type of ignorant construct, some type of willful ignorant construct, which it has become used as now a lot. Okay, as the nation prepared for war in 1940. Congress adopted the Lanham Act to finance housing for workers in defense industries. Lanham Act projects played a particularly important role in segregating urban areas like Frank Stevenson's Richmond, where few African Americans had previously lived. In some cities, the government provided war housing only for whites, leaving African Americans in congested slums and restricting their access to jobs. In other cities, like Richmond, war housing was created for African American workers as well, but it was segregated. By the war's end, the Lanham Act had combined with PWA and USHA programs to create or solidify residential racial segregation in every metropolitan area they had touched. Okay, so let's I'm gonna get in my highlight bag. Let me get my highlighter. All right, y'all. Let me get in my highlighting bag. So let's really look at this. In other cities like Richmond, war housing was created for African American workers as well. Okay, but look, by the war's end, the Lanham Act had combined with PWA and USHA programs to create or solidify residential racial segregation in every metropolitan area they had touched. So we're reading about now. This book is really about the color of law, is about the segregation of American cities, de facto segregation and de jure segregation. And so, to me, this is very important that we're hearing that the Lanham Act, which plays an important part. I want to highlight these dates too. As the nation preparing for war. Again, this is one of the things that I do when reading. So that way, when I want to do a review of the book, or when I want to go back to the book to maybe help to make a point to somebody or explain something to somebody, I have certain portions highlighted that pop out, so I know that this page is important or this segment is important. And so you're hearing about here how the government is supporting these things. I gotta just highlight this whole paragraph. I ain't gonna stunt. It just gives you an idea that these things are not being done just by private companies. The government is supporting these things happening. 3%, the PWI, and I think it's important that we understand this, what integration really was looking like, because there's this idea that integration happened and it happened overnight and it happened seamlessly, and that is still currently going on, when an argument could be made that we are more segregated. All right. When construction of civilian public housing resumed, it continued to promote segregation. Local governments with federal support were responsible for its racial character. Local governments with federal support were responsible for its racial character. Segregation violated constitutional rights, whether it was federal, state, or local government that insisted upon it. The examples that follow from the Northeast, Midwest, and Pacific Coast reflect the racial design that prevailed throughout the country during the war and its aftermath. In 1941, Boston began building the West Broadway project, designated for white middle-class occupancy only. It remained almost entirely white, with only a few token African Americans until a legal complaint by civil rights groups in 1962 forced the city to cease excluding qualified American applicants. Another Boston, okay, so that means that lasted from 1941 to 1962. Another Boston project from the 1940s, Mission Hill, had two sections: Mission Hill itself and across the street, the Mission Hill extension. In 1962, 1,024 families, not one of them African American, lived in Mission Hill. At the Mission Hill extension, 500 of 580 families were African American. 5 years later, after Boston agreed to desegregate the development, Mission Hill was still 97% white, while the Mission Hill expansion had increased to 98% African American. One observer reported, "In the rental office, there are two windows, one for Mission Hill and one for the extension. And except for the absence of two signs saying white and colored, it might be Birmingham, Alabama. There's literally a line of whites and a line of Negroes paying their rent." So this is in Boston. This is in Boston. Another Boston project from the 1940s. Mission Hill in Boston. So this whole one right here is Boston that they're pointing out. Looks like this is going to be so this is Boston. Okay. So again, these are just giving you examples of what the makeup of the land was like, what the tenor of the nation, what the society was like. And so here where it says in 1960, so this was in the 1940s. This is Mission Hill was like this in the 1940s. So we got one example of 1941, the West Broadway project, designated for white middle-class occupancy only. It remained almost entirely white, with only a few token African Americans until a legal complaint by civil rights groups in 1962 forced the city to exclude qualified to cease excluding qualified African American applicants. So 1941 to 1962 on that one. Another Boston project from the 1940s, and again, these are all projects. Another Boston project from the 1940s. Mission Hill, they're talking about how this one had two sections, Mission Hill and then Mission Hill Extension, and how Mission Hill was, in 1962, Mission Hill had 1,024 families, not one of them African American, living there. And at the extension, it was 500 families, and 580 families, and 500 were black. 5 years later, after they agreed to desegregate the developments, Mission Hill was 97% white still, and they had increased the black one to 98%. So that means they had more. It was less white, less integrated. And then one observer reported, "In the rental office, there are two windows, one for Mission Hill and one for the extension. And except for the absence of two signs saying white and colored, it might be Birmingham, Alabama." But this is in Boston. So it's important to understand the tenor of the land. So that way we can stop being in a place where we think these issues only permeated in the South or only permeated in the cities we've seen. We saw big civil rights movements happening at. Cambridge, home of Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also required segregation in its housing projects. In 1935, the Cambridge Housing Authority, in cooperation with the PWA, demolished the low-income tenement neighborhood that had been integrated, mostly by African Americans and European immigrants. There, the authority built Newtown Court, restricted to white tenants. Later, in 1940, Local and federal agencies again worked together to establish Washington Elms, an adjoining segregated project for African Americans. And so we're seeing here, and I think this is important to point out, we're seeing here how they are speaking on areas that are already integrated, and people coming in, whether it be the government or private companies, private housing companies, with federally funded money, or with that are federally funded, coming in and desegregating some of these areas. And I think that that's something that's very important to point out too as we continue to read through this, is that this idea of integration was not something that was foreign or was something that was new cooked up. A lot of Reconstruction led to integration. For people who understand Reconstruction and understand that time in history. So it's very interesting to hear about how they're talking about this is basically they're deintegrating. I was trying to get my pen, y'all. Yeah, I'm trying to get my pen. Deintegration. I mean, I guess you could call it segregation, but this is deintegration because this already have been integrated and they're unintegrating it. Okay, so remember, if you're watching this, share this. In Detroit, a substantial population of African Americans had arrived during World War I, seeking jobs in munitions plants. Most lived in racially separate neighborhoods. Shortly before the United States entered World War II in 1941, the government commissioned a bomb plant in Willow Run, a previously underdeveloped suburban area with no pre-existing racial housing arrangement. Nonetheless, when the government built a new community for the workers, its policy was that only whites could live there. At the time, the Federal Works Agency, FWA, had also been given responsibility for constructing temporary housing for war workers. Clark Foreman, its director, proposed the Detroit development, the Sojourner Truth Homes for African Americans. The project was in the district of Democratic Congressman Rudolph Tennerwitz, who persuaded his colleagues that funding for the agency should be cut off unless Foreman was fired and the Sojourner Truths were assigned only to whites. Wow. The director of the Federal Housing Administration supported Tennerwitz, stating that the presence of African Americans in the area would threaten property values of nearby residents. Foreman was forced to resign. The Federal Works Agency then proposed a different project for African Americans on a plot that the Detroit Housing Commission recommended, in an industrial area deemed unsuitable for whites. It soon became apparent this site, too, would provoke protests because it was not far enough away from a white neighborhood. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt protested to the president. The FWA again reversed course and assigned African Americans to the Sojourner Truth Project. Whites in the neighborhood rioted, leading to 100 arrests. All but 3 were African Americans, and 38 hospitalizations. All but 5 were African Americans. Following the war, Detroit's politicians mobilized white voters by stirring up fear of integration in public housing. Mayor Edward Jeffrey's successful 1945 re-election campaign warned that projects with African Americans could be located in white neighborhoods if his opponent, Dick Frankenstein, won. Jeffrey's literature proclaimed, "Mayor Jeffries is against mixed housing." One leaflet, distributed in white neighborhoods but pretending to be addressed to African Americans, suggested that a vote for Frankenstein would bring black families to white communities. It read, "Negroes can live anywhere with Frankenstein mayor. Negroes, do your duty. November 6th. Okay, so let's start speaking on some different things that have been mentioned in some other books that maybe have not been that we have not expounded upon, or let's speak on some things that have been mentioned in other books, tactics that have been used in other books, as far as politicians working in coordination, whether overtly, covertly, consciously, or subconsciously, with police departments and with state's attorneys and with judges and with people in the legal system, and helping to change the narrative and helping to form the narrative that this society has when it comes to people of color, and helping to stigmatize people of color. And so here we have right here this a mayor using race fears, provoking race fears, using racism. He's politicizing blackness. He's politicizing black life. Negroes can live anywhere with Frankenstein mayor. That is politicizing black life. Think about, and then even this, it speaks about whites in the neighborhood rioting when black people were assigned to move into the neighborhoods that they lived in. Think about that. This is not some foreign time or some time that was 300, 400 years ago. This was 1945. This ain't even 100 years ago. The first lady protested to the president about them moving there. Okay, let's see. I don't even know so much to highlight. How do I even pick what to highlight here? Politicizing. It's like politicizing, using stigmatization as a political tool. Using racial fears, stigmatizing. It's like using. I want to say using. It's weaponizing racial fears as he's weaponizing. That's what he's doing. Weaponizing racial fears. Weaponizing racial fears as a political tactic. That's what's going on, which is sick if you really think about it. Weaponizing racial fears as a political tactic. And so this became an early thing, a thing that we see early on, and a thing that we see happening very often is different people weaponizing racial fears as political tactics. And this is happening in Detroit, not in Birmingham, Alabama. I love that this book, this is one of my favorite things about this book, is that it points out how these things were nationwide. They were not isolated incidents. He used it by stirring up fear of integration in public housing. My neighborhood is rioted, leading to 100 arrests. Think about that. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, protested. And so what we are reading is The Color of Law. Let me turned into two projects. Whites in the neighborhood rioted, leading to Cause of Detroit development. Okay. By the late 1940s, as white families increasingly found shelter in the private market, more African Americans than white families remained dependent on public housing. And then I also remember, now this is starting to form neighborhoods. Like, you can start to see neighborhoods forming. I didn't come in the very beginning. I missed the first chapter. I'm going to have to review that. I have read this before. But you can start to see neighborhoods forming. Again, we are reading The Color of Law. We are reading The Color of Law. Hope that light's kind of bright right there. Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. We're on page 27. Projects built for whites ran the danger of having vacant units that only African Americans would want to fill. In 1948 and 1949, the Detroit City Council held hearings on 12 proposed projects, 7 of which were to be situated in outlying, predominantly white areas. If approved, they would have set Detroit on a hard-to-reverse trajectory of residential integration. But Jeffrey's successor, Alberto Cobo, who had also campaigned against Negro invasions in public housing, vetoed 8 of the 12, including all 7 in the white neighborhoods. Only projects in predominantly African American areas were approved, further solidifying the city's segregation. In Northern California, Richmond was not the only community in which the government created segregation. The San Francisco Housing Authority in 1942 constructed a massive development to house 14,000 workers and their families at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard and began to assign apartments on a non-discriminatory, first-come, first-served basis. The Navy objected, insisting that integration would cause racial conflict among workers and interfere with ship repair. Local officials bowed to the Navy's demand and moved African American tenants to separate sections. Because discrimination by landlords left African American migrant war workers facing a greater housing shortage than whites, the authorities' policy resulted in many vacant units in the white sections while black war worker housing needs went unmet. The San Francisco Housing Authority attempted to recruit white tenants by placing advertisements in light rail commuter cars, despite the long waiting list of African Americans for apartments. This combination of vacant white units and waiting lists for black units increasingly characterized public housing nationwide. Ain't plugged up. Oh man, I didn't mean to hit the mic. My fault, y'all. That was a charger. Charger. Hold on 1 second. One second, y'all. Gotta make sure this is charging. Okay, my fault, y'all. Oof. All right, y'all. Oof. Okay. My fault. Yeah. Yeah. Trying to get right. Okay. All right, y'all. Again, we are reading The Color of Law. Sorry, let me move this mic. We're on page 28. Okay. Okay. Authorities. Units in the white section of black workers. Okay. San Francisco created 5 other projects during the war years, all segregated. 4 were for whites only and were in white neighborhoods: Holly Courts, Potrero Terrace, Sunnydale, and Valencia Gardens. The 5th, West Side Courts. The 5th, West Side Courts, in the Western Addition, was exclusively for African Americans. The Western Addition had been a mixed community, including internment relocated Japanese origin families to internment camps. Their residents were vacated and African Americans were able to rent them, making this one of the few San Francisco neighborhoods where African Americans could find housing. Oh, shit. The Western Addition had been a mixed community, including a large Japanese American population. But when the federal government relocated Japanese origin families to internment camps, their residencies were vacated and African Americans were able to rent them, making this one of the few San Francisco neighborhoods where African Americans could find housing. By placing a segregated project in this integrated area, the Housing Authority propelled its transition to almost all black. The authority seemed to follow a principle that if a neighborhood had even a few African American residents, it should become an African American neighborhood. And so this gets us into a place where we start to understand these neighborhoods better, and we understand the creation of these neighborhoods better, and how these neighborhoods got to be and got to look the way that they look now. And then that lets you know, makes you understand how it was easy to create caste systems and discriminate and things of that nature. In 1942, the San Francisco Authority announced its resolve to maintain segregation by unanimously adopting a resolution. In the selection of tenants, we shall not, insofar as possible, enforce the commingling of races, but shall, insofar as possible, maintain and preserve the same racial composition which exists in the neighborhood where a project is located. One commissioner resigned in protest of the policy, which replicated the neighborhood composition rule that Harold Ikes had adopted. Responding to protests by civil rights groups and African American residents, the authority said it would cease discriminating. But by 1944, only 5 white families resided in the West Side Courts, 136 units, and no African Americans lived in other developments. A housing authority commissioner explained that in West Side Courts, we deliberately allowed a few white families to go in so as not to establish a purely Negro project. By the end of World War II, over 1/3 of San Francisco's African Americans, barred from private housing almost everywhere in the city, were residing in segregated public projects either in the Western Addition or in temporary Hunters Point barracks. I think it's important to point out that line that was said. A housing authority commissioner explained that in the West Side Courts, we deliberately allowed a few white families to go in so as not to establish a purely Negro project. The only integrated war project in the Bay Area was one that housed shipyard workers in Marin County across the Golden Gate Bridge from the city. The project was not integrated purposely. The first buildings were dormitories for single men, and the shipyard's rapid expansion left no time to separate the races. As workers flooded in, officials could barely keep up, just handing out blankets and pillows and assigning rooms that were available. I gotta get something to drink. Okay. Perhaps to their surprise, the officials found that integration presented few problems among the workers, so the biracial character of the project was maintained when workers' families arrived. After a few years, however, private housing in the area became available to whites, and the Marion Project, too, became predominantly African American. I think that's an important. I think that's my fault. This shouldn't even be hitting the mic. I think that's an important characteristic of what it is that we are reading to point out. Not only the purposeful de-integrating of neighborhoods, but also the fact that suburbs started to become created, and black people just were not allowed to live in those suburbs, so that created another form of segregation. After a few years, however, private housing in the area became available to whites. Well, I said suburbs. I should say private housing instead of public housing. Not allowed in suburbs. Not allowed in private. Because this is all speaking about private housing right now. So not allowed in private housing because it's not public. So they don't. Okay. The waffling of San Francisco's elected leaders and housing administrators about whether to segregate public projects, like similar waffling in Boston and elsewhere, makes sense only if these officials knew that the segregation they imposed was wrong, if not unconstitutional. In 1949, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution requiring non-segregation for future housing projects and for filing vacancies on non-discriminatory basis. But the city's housing authority voted to reject the new policy, and as a result, all public housing construction was suspended. A compromise was eventually reached. The housing authority agreed not to discriminate in future projects while maintaining its segregation policy in those already in existence. When the authority proceeded in 1952 to build one of its already planned projects for whites only, the NAACP took it to court. So in 1949, adopted a resolution requiring non-segregation for future housing projects and for filling vacancies on non-discriminatory basis. Okay. The case went to trial in 1953. The housing authority's chairman testified that the agency's intent was to localize occupancy of Negroes in the Western Addition and ensure that no African Americans would reside in projects inhabited by whites. The authority's executive secretary then made this concession. Although projects in white neighborhoods will remain all white, the authority would admit more white applicants to its nearly all-black West Side Courts project and to Hunters Point, where black and white tenants remained segregated by building. It was a meaningless concession because whites were unlikely to apply to reside in West Side Courts now that they had rapidly increasing opportunities to move to the suburbs. Only a decision to assign African Americans to the all-white projects would have promoted integration. Such a proposal was not an offer by the authority. Temporary war units at Hunters Point still housed African Americans 25 years after the war ended. Although most whites had left Hunters Point by then, few African Americans could find homes or apartments elsewhere in the city or its environs. The judge's decision was an NAACP victory. He ruled that the authority's policy violated the 14th Amendment. A California appeals court upheld the finding, instructing San Francisco to abandon segregation and assign black families to projects outside the Western Addition. With contempt for the spirit of the court order, the authority established 3 new public housing projects in other areas that by then had few white residents, ensuring that segregation in these neighborhoods would be reinforced. Moreover, the California decision was not widely imitated. Nationwide, segregation in public housing remained the rule. Okay, then it's going on to Section 4. So I think that we should point out here that whole court case is very important. How they said that West Side Court, it was a meaningless concession because whites were unlikely to apply to live in West Side Courts now that they had rapidly increasing opportunities to move to the suburbs, which we just mentioned about. Only a decision to assign African Americans to the all-white projects would have promoted integration, but such a proposal was not on the table by the authority. And then it says, temporary war units at Hunters Point still housed African Americans 25 years after the war ended. Although most whites had left the community, the African Americans cannot find home or apartments elsewhere in the city or its environs. And again, the court is ruling that these things are wrong, but it doesn't matter because it's not being enforced. They're still continuing to do the same actions. So court ruling is irrelevant. What? Oh, damn, what's wrong with this thing? It's tripping. No. What the hell? Okay. That probably was loud. I'm sorry. Having some mic issues. Having charging issues. Some technical difficulties. Okay. We are on chapter 4. We're on chapter 2, section 4 of chapter 2. Harry Truman became Harry Truman became president upon Roosevelt's death in 1945. By the time he was elected in his own right in 1948, the lack of civilian housing had reached a crisis. By the time he was elected in his own right in 1948, the lack of civilian housing had reached a crisis. The millions of returning World War II veterans and their baby boom families needed shelter, and there was a severe shortage. In 1949, Truman proposed a new public housing effort. Conservative Republicans had long opposed any government involvement in the private housing market. They had supported the Lanham Act as a war measure only because it contained a commitment that all federal housing for war workers would be demolished or taken over by localities after hostilities ceased. By localists after hostilities ceased. To defeat Truman's bill, they attempted to saddle the legislation with an amendment prohibiting segregation and racial discrimination in public housing. The conservatives knew that if such an amendment were adopted, Southern Democrats would kill the legislation. Without the amendment, the Southerners would support public housing as they had other progressive economic legislation throughout the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, provided the bills did not challenge segregation. Many Southern Democrats particularly wanted public housing for white constituents in their own districts and states. Liberals, led by Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey and Illinois Senator Paul Douglas, had to choose between enacting a segregated public housing program or no program at all. On the Senate floor, Douglas proclaimed, "I should like to point out to my Negro friends what a large amount of housing they will get under this act. I am ready to appeal to history and to time that it is in the best interest of the Negro race that we carry through the housing programs as planned rather than put in the bill an amendment which will inevitably defeat it." The Senate and House rejected the proposed integration amendments, and the 1949 Housing Act was adopted, permitting local authorities to continue to design separate public housing projects for blacks and whites or to segregate blacks and whites within projects. All right, so I just want to point that out. This is the Senate and House rejected the proposal of the integration of the amendment, and the 1949 Housing Act was adopted, permitting local authorities to continue to design separate public housing projects for blacks and whites to segregate blacks and whites within projects. And so that's 1949 that this is an act that is a housing act. And so I think it's important to point out that they're not saying in this act that to segregate, but the only thing they're doing is they're not putting anything in there that makes it illegal for them to segregate or that will prevent them from segregating or putting in some type of fail-safe to make sure that segregation doesn't happen or anything to promote integration. And so to me, that is the issue that we're going to see going forward, is that the government is just being hands off and allowing what they know is naturally going on in societies to persist. Even this Illinois senator is basically saying, let's not even try to fight to do the right thing because of the likelihood we won't be able to succeed in that fight. And that speaks to the societal issues and to the lack of moral integrity in a lot of these situations. You want to come back, or how you want to do it? Yeah. Okay. Ari's back. Weather.
How much longer is supposed to rain? Did you know?
Harry said 8.
Harry said 8.
He said it should be on and off until about 8. Not a question. But it has started. What's it look like on there?
I don't know. No, I feel like
radar.
I feel compelled to go to the radar.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not really exactly sure, Okay. Where are we?
Right at that the last paragraph on the
Harry Truman? On the right-hand side.
The last paragraph on the right-hand side.
Okay, so what is such segregation?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's look at this radar real quick. She's probably gonna have to move in a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What is? There's also different radars.
What?
Yeah, there's like local radars and there's like national radars.
Global radars?
Global?
Is there global radars too? It's like
Probably.
planetary?
Okay, so based on this radar, this what?
Got the big thing
Well, it move real quick. It move.
Okay, that's what big one is on. Oh, damn, that don't move.
Oh damn!
Damn. What was that last shit?
I don't know. Let me find the global one, and not the global one. The local one. Oh, see? Okay, here we go.
And I thought Brittany won. It still looked like she lost. I said congratulations. I feel bad now.
Brittany.
Yeah. School board.
Ashley. Oh, yeah. Yeah, she had one in Rockford.
Really?
But in the other Winnebago County cities, she had lost by just like a little, I want to say like less than a percent.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And that was... Okay. You get back. Oh damn, that's my cousin.
What?
He's not really my cousin. He's the father of my cousin's children. He just joined. I saw his name. Joined the live. Whether such segregation was in anyone's best interest is doubtful. True, without public housing, tens of thousands of African Americans would have had to remain in tenements. That's what I've been saying, but would have to remain in tenements that were out of compliance with the most minimal municipal building and health codes. But with the segregated projects, African Americans became more removed from mainstream society. Mainstream society than ever, packed into high-rise ghettos where community life was impossible, where access to jobs and social services was more difficult. I thought it was like some type of spray, and I was like, "The fuck did he?" I apologize for my, it's early morning hours, and where supervision of adolescents and even a semblance of community policing was impractical. The NAACP, for one, was unwilling to sacrifice integration for more housing and supported the 1949 Integration Amendment, despite its cynical sponsorship. So did a few congressional radicals, led by Vito Marcantonio of New York, who argued on the House floor that you have no right to use housing against civil rights. Housing is advanced in the interest of the general welfare and in the interest of strengthening democracy. When you separate civil rights from housing, you weaken general welfare. In the wake of Congress's repudiation of integration, government administrators reiterated a commitment to segregation, insisting that they could not impose by regulation what Congress specifically rejected. The director of the Federal Division of Slum Clearance justified the use of redevelopment funds to demolish black neighborhoods and replace them with housing for whites, saying, "It does not appear reasonable to assume that we can impose an anti-segregation requirement in light of the congressional intention as evidenced by its vote on the amendment." With funds from the 1949 Act, massive segregated high-rise projects were constructed nationwide, including the Robert Taylor and Cabrini Green homes in Chicago, Rosen homes in Should We Kill and Should We Kill Falls in Philadelphia. Van Dyke houses in New York City, and the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in St. Louis. Although public housing was rapidly becoming a program exclusively for African Americans, working class whites were accommodated in places where they still needed housing. The Igoe Towers, for example, where they still needed housing. The Igoe Towers, for example, were initially reserved for whites only, while Pruitt was for African Americans. Black families were accepted in Igoe only when whites could no longer be found to fill vacancies. In about a dozen states, among them California, Iowa, Minnesota, Virginia, and Wisconsin, the few suburban officials who may have wanted integrated developments were prevented by state constitutional amendments adopted in the 1950s that required a local referendum before building a low-income family public housing project. Middle white class communities then systematically vetoed public housing proposals. A lower federal court found such referenda requirements unconstitutional because their racial motivation was so obvious. Referenda were not required, for example, for low-income senior citizen housing. But in 1971, the Supreme Court ruled otherwise, upholding the referendum provisions on the grounds that they preserved democratic decision-making. In 1952, its last year in office, the Truman administration had adopted a new racial equity formula that required local housing authorities that practice segregation to build separate projects to house low-income black families in proportion to their need. An attempt to address a pervasive situation in which large number of white designated units remained vacant while African Americans stayed impatiently on overflowing waiting lists. Dwight D. Eisenhower succeeded Truman as president in 1953, becoming the first Republican to hold the office in 20 years. A political realignment with Republicans becoming more conservative than Northern Democrats on matters of racial equality was underway. Soon, the new administration began to reverse the few halting steps towards non-discrimination that the Roosevelt and Truman administration had taken or considered. Following the Supreme Court's 1954 decision invalidating separate but equal public education, Birchman's Fitzpatrick, General Counsel of the Housing and Home Finance Agency, stated that the decision did not apply to housing. In 1955, President Eisenhower's housing administrator told the Congressional Committee that the government should not move too precipitously to eliminate racial segregation from federal programs. The administration formally abolished a policy, it had never been enforced, that African Americans and whites receive public housing of equal equality. It also ended even nominal adherence to requirements that local housing authorities give priority to the neediest applicants, regardless of their race, and that the net supply of housing available to African Americans not be reduced by demolition projects. In the 1950s, some housing authorities built scatter site rather than concentrated units, having recognized that high-rise ghettos for the poor aggravated residents' desperate and generated more crime. desperation. Right. Let's start that over. In the 1950s, some housing authorities built scatter site rather than concentrated units, having recognized that high-rise ghettos for the poor aggravated residents' desperation and generated more crime. They also hoped that scattered units would provoke less opposition from whites. In the mid-1970s, the federal government began to recommend that cities use their public housing funds this way. Yet most cities, Chicago and Philadelphia being extreme examples, continue to situate public housing in predominantly low-income African American neighborhoods. A few municipalities did begin to use funds to scatter site projects, but these were typically cities with small low-income African American populations. Public housing authorities not only continued to choose segregation. Public housing authorities not only continued to use segregated sites for new developments, but made efforts to segregate existing projects where integration may have been tolerated. In 1960, for example, the Housing Authority of Savannah evicted all white families from its integrated Francis Bartow project, creating an all-black complex. The authority justified this policy by observing that with national and local housing shortages abating, whites could easily find homes elsewhere, and African Americans needed the public projects more. In 1984, investigative reporters for the Dallas Morning News visited federally funded developments in 47 metropolitan areas. The reporters found that the nation's nearly 10 million public housing tenants were almost always segregated by race, and that every predominantly white occupied project had facilities, amenities, services, and maintenance that were superior to what was found in predominantly black occupied projects. By the 1960s, when few white families were still living in urban public housing, civil rights groups had little remaining reason to challenge the discriminatory assignment of tenants. Instead, their focus shifted onto opposing the placement of what had become predominantly African American projects in already segregated neighborhoods, increasing residents' racial isolation. In 1976, the Supreme Court adopted lower court findings that the Chicago Housing Authority, with the complicity of federal housing agents, had unconstitutionally selected sites to maintain the city's segregated landscape. Although the authority had suggested tracts that would integrate white neighborhoods, each project was subject to veto by the alderman in whose ward it was proposed. In his ruling, the district judge who originally heard the case wrote, No criterion other than race can plausibly explain the veto of over 99.5% of the housing units located on the white sites, where they were originally selected on the basis of CHA's expert judgment, and at the same time, the rejection of only 10% or so of the units on black sites, not to be confused with black sites. In the years leading up to the final ruling, the city of Chicago had blocked efforts by the CHA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to comply with consent decrees and lower court decisions. In 1971, for example, CHA officials identified identified land for new projects that included some predominantly white areas. Unlike the high-rises that the agencies had built to concentrate public housing in a black ghetto, these proposals were for low-rise scatter site housing. Excuse me. But they still would have had African American tenants. Mayor Richard J. Daley rejected the proposal, saying that public housing should not go where it was not accepted. In defending HUD before the Supreme Court, President Gerald Ford, Solicitor General Robert Bork, expressed the government's opposition to placing public housing in white areas. This is a quote. There will be an enormous practical impact on innocent communities who have to bear the burden of public housing, who will have to house a plaintiff class from Chicago, which they wronged in no way. Thus, the federal government described non-discriminatory housing policy as punishment visited on the innocent. The Supreme Court rejected Bork's objection, upholding lower court orders that HUD must henceforth construct apartments in predominantly white areas of Chicago and its suburbs. The CHA and HUD response was to cease building public housing altogether. Yet, even if the CHA, HUD, and the city of Chicago itself had complied with the Supreme Court's decision and built units in the city's white communities, it mostly would have been too late. The litigation had dragged on for years, during which time most of the vacant land in white neighborhoods that could have been used for scatter site housing had been developed. Following the Supreme Court decision, the separation of African Americans from other families in Chicago increased. As whites in integrated urban neighborhoods departed for the suburbs, the Chicago area share of African Americans living in all black areas grew. Other federal court decisions or settlements in Baltimore, Dallas, and San Francisco, Yonkers, and elsewhere also recognized that HUD or local governments had created or perpetuated segregation. In Miami, for example, African Americans eligible for public housing were assigned to distinct projects, while eligible whites were given vouchers for rentals of private apartments to subsidize their dispersal throughout the community. It was not until 1998 that civil rights groups won a requirement that vouchers be offered to African Americans as well. Too late to reverse the city's segregation. In most other cities, court orders and legal settlements were also not sufficient to undo segregation that the federal, state, and local government had created and abetted. From the beginning, the real estate industry bitterly fought public housing of any kind, and had support from Republicans in Congress. Industry lobbyists insisted that socialism in housing was a threat to private enterprise. A difficult argument to make when, from the 1930s to the end of World War II, private enterprise had been unwilling or unable to develop dwellings affordable for working and middle-class families. But once the housing shortage eased, The real estate lobby was successful in restricting public housing to subsidized projects for the poorest families only. New federal and local requirements set forth excuse me. But once the housing shortage eased, the real estate lobby was successful in restricting public housing to subsidized projects for the poorest families only. New federal and local regulations set forth strict upper income limits for families in public housing. Beginning in about 1950, many middle-class families, white and black, were forced out under these new rules, although many would have preferred to stay in the low-rise, scatter site, and well-maintained projects that mostly characterized 1949 public dwellings. This policy change, mostly complete by the late 1960s, ensured that integrated public housing would cease to be possible. It transformed public housing into a warehousing system for the poor. The condition of public projects rapidly deteriorated, partly because housing authority maintenance workers and their families had to leave the buildings where they worked when their wages made them ineligible to live there, and partly because of the loss of middle-class rents resulted in inadequate maintenance budgets. The federal government had required public housing to be made available only to families who required substantial subsidies. Who needed substantial subsidies, while the same government declined to provide sufficient subsidies to make public housing a decent place to live. The loss of middle-class tenants also insists on adequate funds for their project's upkeep and amenities. As a result, the conditions and then the reputation of public housing collapsed. By 1973, the changeover was mostly complete. President Richard Nixon announced that public housing should not be forced on white communities that didn't want it, and he reported it to Congress that many public housing projects were monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, crime-ridden. Throughout the mid-20th century, government housing projects frequently denied the racial character of neighborhoods that endured for many years afterward. Reflecting on public housing in his state, Carey McWilliams, who had been California's housing commissioner in the early years of World War II, later wrote that the federal government had an effect between planting the seeds of Jim Crow practices throughout the region under the guise of respecting local attitudes. We can only wonder what our urban areas will look like today. Instead, I lost my spot. Instead, we can only let's start the sentence over. We can only wonder what our urban areas will look like today if, instead of creating segregations where it never or perhaps barely existed, using public housing as a unique example of how integrated living could be successful. That's the end of chapter 2. I don't know how well you can see that. was like a postcard. St. Louis, 1916. Oh, it's a leaflet. Leaflet urging voters to adopt a referendum that prohibited African Americans from moving into predominantly white blocks.
This is a little different from some of the, not some of it was completely different from the things we've read before.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the overall message or overall theme that they're getting across, what in the first chapter of the new theme, what some of the things that stand out, and is it anything that you read in that chapter that makes you think about things that have we read last week?
About two different things. Well, three really. Now that you said the last question, the first one is the how quick they are to remove people who have committed some type of what is deemed to be a crime. How quick they are to remove those type of people who are deemed to have committed some type of crime. How quick they are to remove those people from public housing. That's kind of what has been going through my mind. But I also been thinking about Donald Sterling. That happened in 2014, I think so. 2014. I can't remember if I was in. I think that it was in the summer, wasn't it? Summer. It was summer. No, because the playoffs were going on. Remember? Spring, summer. So early 2014.
What's early?
Not as opposed to like October.
Oh,
Yeah. So I was in 8th grade. So I was about to graduate from 8th grade. So I really didn't have no type of full understanding of it. What actually was going on with the Donald Sterling case, or the allegations made against Donald Sterling. But I remember them watching it. I remember the Clippers turning out their jerseys or turning out their warm-ups. And when a lot of situations like that, where one case gets brought up or one incident gets brought up of a person's alleged wrongdoing or misconduct, then oftentimes it's time to reflect and go back into what else this person may have done that may have been borderline or may have been just flat out a wrongdoing. So I remember, I think 2 or 3 years ago, ESPN that had released like a podcast series, a 30 for 30 podcast series about the Donald Sterling tapes, and it chronicled the tapes as well. I've been saying chronicle too much. Yeah, it chronicled the tapes as well as the different type of other lawsuits that he had, and so that was making me think about that as well. It's been a while since I listened to that. I was planning on going back and listening to that at some point today. It talks to about. I remember one incident. I believe his wife's name was Shelley. And something that she would do is, first of all, they would build these. They would either build or buy these apartment buildings, and they would rent them out, and they would name them some crazy name that it would lead you to believe that this was some spectacular, thing.
Right.
And they weren't. They were just the conditions in those apartments weren't that good. It was very just like copy and paste, just deteriorated returns, deteriorated means. Yeah, but I remember one incident that they had talked about is Shelley Sterling. She would go in, and not on her own. This is like a planned thing that they would do, and they would only rent to certain people. They would only rent to certain people. But they would also, a thing that Shelley would do is she would go in and pretend to be like some type of inspection worker or anything like that and look around the home. And it was almost disproportionately to people that they didn't want in their apartments, in their housing projects. And so that made me think about that, and I really wanted to go back and listen to that. Then I also, on top of that, was thinking about what's his name? Not Pastor Brown. Not Pastor Brown, but the came by with his son, DB. Pastor Shelby, yeah, Pastor Shelby, and his big thing where he had sent us many videos that were insightful, but it talked a lot about containment and how they. I can't get into it exactly. I haven't listened to it in a while, where they talked about the containment of African Americans, the containment of poor people. So it made me think about that, but it also made me think about how in I can't remember which book it was. I can't remember which book. Some of these are starting to blend into each other. Where they had talked about how. The second time? Yeah. Okay. But they had talked about how cops get to choose where they work. Or cops get to choose what areas they look at. So then it made me think about how the city builds these areas that are designated for African Americans. They build these. So yeah, talked about slums or build these areas designated for its It's kind. What would that be? That would be like de facto.
Some of it is in that portion there. Some was some of the intentions of it, like the way that it's written, like the times when the cities are like when the city council is like. I guess some of them is I guess different people might have different opinions, but in my opinion, is de facto like sometimes it would be an integrated neighborhood, and they would go in, and then they were like de-integrated and then segregated. And to me, that's more of the juror segregation instead of de facto segregation. Now, the people who might that going forward, it might become de facto segregation, where But to me, once the city council vetoing extra public housing, when things like that happen, to me, that's when it becomes like the juror segregation.
Damn, I guess I thought about a lot of different things. Because it also made me think about, what is it, Swedish American? Or Stockholm Men? It made me think about Stockholm Men. Yeah, and the racist gathering that they held. That's what made me think. So it made me want to look into more things. Both on a national level as well as a local level.
Before you read that, let me ask you now.
Go ahead.
To connect that to, I like that you did connect it to Rockford here. But now to connect that to what we've read for the past week, do you think, let me ask you this question, how much more complicated do you think it would have been for to wage the drug war on a specific race of people, or to try to criminalize a specific race of people if low-income neighborhoods were more integrated, or some of these neighborhoods that ended up, being, because you haven't got to it yet, but somewhere in this book basically they stop. It's already sort of happening, but they stopped taking care of the public housing.
Yeah, it talked about how the conditions had deteriorated when they were assigned, when less and less white folks started using.
And so the maintenance, whoever's going to do maintenance is going to have to be a white person. The bugs, all the jobs, I talked to somebody about this before, but all the jobs to keep up the houses was going to have to go through white people. So now that when white people wasn't there, they were less incentivized to go and go do that. But let's say that, because you read about how in here, it's not out the realm of possibility that they let them build these homes in some of these neighborhoods, before, because I think it's important in there that they point out, it's not poor people. I mean, poor people, it's not all poor people living in the housing projects, They went to explain how that's not what it was at first,
Yeah, it was designed for middle and working class families, white families.
So just putting the housing project, like now it's a context of you're putting poor people in the neighborhood. But back then that wasn't the context. It was just you was putting black people in the neighborhood. So let's say that they put those black people in the neighborhoods who had the money to live in the neighborhoods would have been integrated, and the poor people who were white would have been in the areas of black people that were white. How much differently do you think things like the war on drugs would?
That's a good question. Well, if they, I do think if they hadn't had the thought to segregate these situations, maybe that would that would change of how they went about the war on drugs, just in general. If they had enough thought at the time, enough insight at the time, enough care at the time to not go out of their way to segregate segregate it, I would think that however many decades down the line, 2, 3 decades down the line, when it was time when the war on drugs really took off, that maybe they would still wage it on poor people. It talks about pretty heavily in other books that it was African Americans as well as poor people in poor communities. But as far as waging a war that would disproportionately affect a different race, to like these not these villages, but these areas were designated for African Americans, and they also got the least amount of care. So it made it almost easy to be able to wage this war on drugs because there was a certain amount of vulnerability there. There was a certain amount of I'll just go with vulnerability there. So if they hadn't segregated these public housing or stigmatized as public housing the way that they did, I don't think that the war on drugs goes around about the same way. I do think that we are still in. That being said, if they still had integrated it, there were still problems with integration. So it's not as if that had rid itself of racism, but we were also in capitalistic society as well. So it would wage the war still, but on just poorer communities than it would be. And perhaps it still would be disproportionately affecting African Americans, but that's really hard to say, given that I couldn't see that based on actions they've done before that and actions they've done since that would be a drastic change. Like that would almost be out of character. That'd be almost out of character for America to all of a sudden at that point stop segregating, to stop to openly accept and willingly accept integrated cities and integrated public housing and integrated neighborhoods.
I think the last thing, and I'll let you keep reading, I actually like other stuff later, but one of the other things that happened a lot in what you've read before is they do a good job of pointing out the politicians and how elected officials played a part in some of these things happening. I'm not sure if on yours it had anything. Did the part you read have anything about that? I came in right when they sort of touched on it pretty heavily for a couple of things.
It talked a little bit at the end about Eisenhower and how he was the first Republican in 20 years or so. No, not Eisenhower. I'm sorry. I mess up. Yes, I was right. It was talked about Eisenhower, and he was the first Republican in 20 years. And also talked about a little bit, just real briefly, how that was starting to switch. That Republicans were starting to be more conservative than Northern Democrats, and so briefly touched on it, but not really in depth, really, about certain politicians. Most.
Go back 3 pages. I had
from where?
Back to where I had read at.
To where?
It should be I had highlighted something.
Yeah, highlighted something.
Okay, right there.
This one?
That portion right there talks about how one of the mayor, it was 2 mayors running for office, and one of them sent out fake pamphlets that said that his opponent wanted to integrate public housing, in the effort to make white people think that was going to move into the neighborhood. So the thing that stood out to me then was also they talked about the first lady, asking the president to make sure that they didn't put these black public housing into a white neighborhood. But the thing that stood out to me then was that was how important the politicians have been in gauging the thought patterns, of the society. You don't necessarily you could race could have been an issue without being weaponized. And every politician doesn't, weaponize race, all the time, or politicize race all the time. But it became became like economics. That's what I was starting to realize. Like it became like economics, like how started, socialist or capitalist or Democrat or Republican. It became like racist or not racist.
Mm.
It wasn't necessarily the idea. I don't even think sometimes it was necessarily the idea that they were really racist. It was just like another card to play to maybe get a couple of extra voters. Even as you start to see the Democrat and the Republican Party change over, and them starting to do different things, it's never really comes out of an integrity place. It always seems to come out of a voting place. So with that being said, do you think that the constituents are in any form responsible for allowing politicians to do these things?
Oh yes, yes.
Today, we get to a place, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, we have people get elected off of using the race card in certain aspects. Whether it's Joe Biden saying if you don't vote for me, you're not black, or Donald Trump saying what do you have to lose.
He can't even say law and order. Look at him. Look at him. He can't even say law and order.
And Martin Luther King said he sat down with Richard Nixon and he was genuine about civil rights. And that he felt that he was genuine. So do you think it's a point where, since we are the voters and since you cannot vote for a certain person, and since votes do speak, do you think that we play any?
Yes, I do, and that's something that was touched upon in one of the sections I read. And Until We Reckon, how she got into prosecutors are the most powerful people, which has been consistently brought up. How I think that was end of policing, where it brought up a lot of people think that maybe the judges at first. A lot of people, maybe it's the cops at first that have the most amount of discretion or the most amount of power. But in reality, it's the prosecutors. They can decide what charges they bring up, what if they're going to trial, what offer they bring up, what offer they're going to do, how they present the case. So, and she had talked about how different type of prosecutors that are in there, and she did blame. Shouldn't have said that. She did put try to hold the constituents responsible that a lot of these the district attorney and the state attorney, that's the same thing. The same thing. Okay, I just want to make sure. But she had talked about how these are elected officials, and she had talked about the difference between culture change and policy change, and culture change comes before policy change, and how if we can change the culture of things, then we can get to a point where we change the policy of things. If we get to a point where people's mindsets have evolved, or people can be more empathetic and put themselves in other positions and in situations like that, where we can demand change, we can demand by changing the culture. That's how we can get through policy change. And I forget. I'm trying to remember exactly what she said, but I cannot remember exactly. She had a real phrase in there. 'Cause she opposed it in two different forms. She talked about how it could be the current constituents demanding new things in which they have never demanded it before. That can be a result of change. That can be a coming of change. It also could be. I think that's where I stopped reading. So I don't think I got to read the second part, but she did talk about it, how it could be the current constituents that they demand that change, that they demand and create that culture change. Then the prosecutors will go about things totally differently. So. Okay. It's already 7:18. People are coming into work. Tom's at work already. Okay. I really have no idea. See, it's at 5:30 a.m., but this is past. I need to see. Why are you showing me the past? Okay. Let's say rain till maybe. Oh, nope, it come back. Okay. Let's say rain at 8, then it stopped, then it come back around noon.
Stop at 2?
Noon. But it's it looks like it's sporadic, like Terry was saying. So I do think we should probably. No, we should probably, but yeah. Mhm. Okay. We're gonna end this live. We're on chapter 3 of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
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 Weinstein.
Rothschild.